This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Welcome to Uncorking a Story, the podcast that introduces you to the rich world of storytellers who share their personal journeys, creative processes, and the stories behind their stories, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Mike Carlon, and I'm thrilled to be part of your writing journey. If you're an aspiring writer, a literary enthusiast, or simply someone who believes in the transformative power of words, you've come to the right place. Every week, we'll pop the cork on the world of successful storytellers and give you a healthy pour of inspiration, insight, and empowerment. My mission is to help writers like you realize your full potential through the transformative and therapeutic power of writing. Whether you're just starting your literary voyage or looking to refine your craft, I'm here to provide you with the knowledge, inspiration, and encouragement you need to embark on your own storytelling adventure. So, are you ready to uncork your story and let your creativity flow? Uncorking a Story is about to begin. Sit back, relax, and let the transformative magic of storytelling whisk you away. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Pat Suprenant has a love for uncovering long-forgotten histories and sharing them with today's readers. She joins me today at Uncorking a Story to discuss her career and debut novel, Behind the Scarlet Letter, based on a true story. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Pat.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pat, I'm excited to have you here, and I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
Well, I've thought about that, question for a while now as to where did I actually start and where did it begin? And I guess I'd have to say that I've always loved writing. But I think the most profound influence on my writing actually occurred very early in high school. I was fortunate enough to have a teacher who was a retired editor for the Springfield Union. His name was Joseph Cotton. And it was kind of a lark, I think, for him to come into high school after retirement and teach a bunch of high school students journalism. And he would frequently, aside from teaching us, the basics, the inverted pyramid, who, what, when, where, how, and why, and the importance of getting, your facts straight and not putting any, subjectivity into what you were reporting. He loved to tell the story about how one of his cub reporters was none other than Tom Wolfe, and how he would send him out. Before Wolfe worked for the Washington Post, he actually started at the Springfield Union, and he would send him out to cover stories, just a regular, say, town council meeting. And he would come back, instead of reporting or recording the events, he recorded it from the perspective of the shoes they were wearing, the hats they had on, their clothing. And so, he laughed about it at that point. After the fact, obviously, he became very famous as a novelist. And so out of that came this new, what they called new journalism. And so some people now call it creative nonfiction. I like to think of what I do as basically a nonfiction novel. I like to stick to basically factual stories, but create them in a fictional manner. And so, it sort of merges my love with writing, straight journalism, and also with creative fiction.
Yeah, that's so cool that you had a teacher in high school who
it was
had that
great.
kind of influence, and just hearing the name Tom Wolfe, I picture a guy in a white suit, right? Was he famous for wearing a white suit all the time?
He was famous, most famous for Bonfire of the Vanities. Yeah. And his last novel, which is really interesting, was Back to Blood, which came out in 2014. And I think those writers listening to your podcast, and yourself included, will find this really interesting. His novel at that time, that was his last published novel before he died, was considered a failure because he only sold 62,000 copies. And I think today of the bar now is 8,000, and you're a wild success, are you not? It used to be 10, now it's down to 8. But I think of that and I say, wow, this is, in fact, he used to laugh about it because he'd say, I tell people the concept of the story, Back to Blood, and it's like looking at a horse falling asleep standing up. So, but yeah, that's where the love for it came from. It was so real to me. And my first a career objective actually was to be a journalist, to actually be a reporter. But life and circumstances got in the way, and I sort of took I circumvented it, but eventually circled back to it much later. It was always on the bucket list.
So what got you off track for that career choice?
Well, for one thing, it was difficult in those days. It never paid a lot of money to be a journalist. It certainly doesn't today, unless you're one of the very successful personalities, I'll call them, in their own right. But it's always been a not high-paying job. So what I did is I went back to graduate school. I got a master's degree in anthropology and went off in a completely different direction. Writing was always a piece of in those days, I did poetry and I did a lot of things for myself, but nothing that I tried to actually publish. And then I later went on to really went off the rails after working in the field of mental health for 7 years. I went back and got an MBA and focused on finance. And so, yeah, as they say, the rest is history. But yeah, I mean, that's the fun of life, is taking all these different, sidebar turns and discovering what you really like and what you really enjoy doing, what your passion is. But it's not I guess it's not very linear to tell you how I went from this point to that point, but it's the best I can do.
Well, linear stories are kind of boring.
I suppose.
I mean, I'm curious, the link between anthropology and then mental health and then finance.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a through line there?
I guess I'm the through line. I mean, I used to get that. It's interesting, when I was interviewed for one of the large insurance companies in Connecticut, I was asked that question all the time in my interviews. How does this resume make any sense? And I'd always say, it makes perfect sense to me because it's my life. And I always find things that are of interest to me. And always there's connections. I bring every one of those degrees and all of that experience to play or to bear in anything I'm doing, whether it's, working on a corporate deal or, just thinking of how to plot a novel. They all come into play. With respect to writing a novel or writing in general, I think anthropology is a natural. I mean, think about it. Archaeology. What do you have there? You've got bones, shards, you've got arrowheads. And from those basic pieces of evidence and information, you create a story. It's basically a narrative of our beginnings as human beings. So for me, that's a natural, because what I have done, and I do focus on historical fiction, and in particular, and this wasn't conscious, but I've become somewhat of an expert in the period between 1790 and 1831. And so that's sort of the realm that I live in, if you will. I know the time period, what people wore, how they spoke, what they'd dressed in, so that's the world that I occupy when I write my novels. And so for me, the analogy between, say, archaeology and a novel, historical fiction, is that you're doing the same thing, but instead of bones and pot charts, you're literally looking at, estate documents, wills, memoirs, newspaper articles of the time, maybe current events, fiction, that sort of anything that's going on in those time periods. So you're basically doing the same thing. You're weaving a story, but you're looking at different evidence to create that story.
You mentioned being up in Hartford or interviewing for an insurance company in Hartford, and then that time period that you specialized in. Did you ever spend any time in Old Sturbridge Village?
Oh, yes. I've been to Old Sturbridge Village more than once. And some of that's a little bit later in terms of the time period, okay, that I spent. But it's good enough to walk through, to sort of experience it, to understand. It's a little bit later in the time period. But oh, yeah. And Mystic, been to Mystic, sure. Been to Sturbridge. Yes, all of them. Right.
Yeah. And I remember going to Sturbridge Village on a probably a 5th grade field trip. And
of course,
they take it very seriously up there. I mean, they do not break character.
Sometimes they do. I think years ago they were more, I don't want to say more into it, but yes, definitely decades ago. I think the last time I went up there was probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Mostly I wanted some photographs that didn't have telephone poles and things like that in them for the purpose of Instagram and so forth. So yeah, but I mean, with respect to historical fiction, it's not unlike someone who creates a fantasy world. Somebody like Tolkien had a complete world that he created, which included even a language. So it's immersion. But I want to emphasize that the type of fiction that I'm interested in is to tell forgotten stories, forgotten scandals, forgotten people, and then try to make them, try to immerse the reader in that time period as best I can. So that's not unlike someone who has a fantasy world that they've created and they know their characters, they know their world, they know the languages they speak. It's the same thing. So it's not, I want to distinguish what I do from some people who will take a time period, like say, oh, I want to write about Josephine and Napoleon. And so they sort of tangentially put those characters in. I would probably pick a character, either Josephine or someone, and then I dig very deep, extremely deep into the characters, do a lot of research, and try to make it more of a character-driven story. See, when you actually write about people who existed, the emphasis is less upon plot and I think more upon character, because obviously people probably might even know what the plot is. People pretty much know what happened to Napoleon. They knew what happened to Josephine. So where do you find the intrigue? You tell the story either through his valet or her maid or something like that. So that's the difference between that. Because some people do write historical fiction, say, for instance, romance, but it's just the time period. Or it's a time slip period or something like that. Now, it's not to demean it at all. They all have their place. They all have their role.
Yeah. When did you start writing again? And when did it become, more of kind of what you do versus, your past careers?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that it occurred you have to go back to the other career I started in 2012 when I decided that as an experiment, I wanted to start a local newspaper. So I started, along with my business partner, Tony Lent, a newspaper called the Mansfield Independent News. And since you're an alum of UConn, you know where Mansfield is. So I loved it. It was a monthly newspaper. I was, the editor, the writer. I went to probably 5 or 6 meetings a week. I covered the town hall from stem to stern. This is a very interesting town to live in. And so what happened was I sort of fell back in love with, wanted to pursue this. And it became I thought it was very successful. Direct mailed. It was low tech. We did this intentionally. It was not online. It was direct mail. And it worked. And I'm a big, big believer in local news and local journalism. And I think if we had more of that today, there's so much focus on the national level. People hardly know what's going on in their own backyard. So from that, and that was between, I'd say, 2012 and 2016. Well, in that time period, I went to an auction and I found a memoir, Amy Rogers' memoir. Started reading it and I went, wait a minute, this is really interesting. So I bid on that to get it and found out that this was, in the end, what I found out was that wasn't just an interesting story. That was the foundation case for Roe v. Wade. And you had me hooked with that. And I felt like it was a story that had to come out. So I went back and forth between tell it as creative nonfiction, I always do this, tell it as fiction, and through what point of view? I mean, I have a novel I'm working on right now that I've written first person, second person, third person, and even creative nonfiction. I've tried it in 3 or 4, until I find something that works. And in this particular novel, I have used multiple points of view because I found that was the most compelling way to tell that story, was to tell it through the eyes of various characters rather than just one person or one point of view.
Well, so this is a good segue into Behind the Scarlet Letter. So what more can you share with us about that, Pat?
Well, what would you like to know?
Well, in cases of fiction, we don't want to give too much away, of course,
Mhm.
but really, so it sounds like this idea started with this auction. You're bidding on this work at auction.
Yes, yes, and I've thought about that because if anybody, I'm sure many people out there are familiar with the Scarlet Letter. It was a classic, and back in the day, it was taught in most high school classes. Today, I understand that that's not so much the case. So you have a lot of young readers coming up who wouldn't even know what that reference was to. The reason I came up with the title Behind the Scarlet Letter because this is the story that is behind the Scarlet Letter story. In other words, if Hawthorne were alive today, this was probably the story he would tell. Um, People, first of all, also have to remember that Hawthorne's story is historical fiction. He wrote a historical fiction novel. He set it in the 1600s. What people also have to realize is that the principal characters involved in that story, particularly Amy Rogers, was alive at the time, and he was extremely litigious. So he published that novel about 2 years before Amy died. And any reader at the time, and by the way, the Scarlet Letter was the first novel that like took off like wildfire in this country. People who read that knew exactly who he was talking about. Because this story has been lost to time, to our generation, doesn't mean that it was lost to um, the readers of that day. This story was covered in every newspaper in New England, from Maine, all the way down to New York and into Pennsylvania. In fact, one of the principal witnesses in the trial was himself a reporter. He owned a paper up in Springfield, so he was the first to actually kind of cover it. And then the trial judge sent out his own summary of the testimony, and then Amy also self-published. He was one of our first self-publishers. And he had something like 5 versions of it, which I reference in the book and say he got more innocent with each time he wrote it.
Well, for those listeners who are not as familiar with the story that you're talking about,
Scarlet Letter.
yeah, well, the Scarlet Letter, yeah, but also the story that it's based on, or the trial that it's based on, the facts that it's based on. How can you just educate us a little bit more on that?
Well, it was, again, the Behind the Scarlet Letter and the Scarlet Letter itself is I think very it's let me just backtrack to my finding the book is very similar to what I think happened with Hawthorne, which is, he sets his novel. He says he finds this book. Here it is right here. He finds this book. This is the book that Amy published, self-published. So he finds that book in the customs house. He sits down and he reads it. I think he read it when he was in college, because he was about 18 when that book came out. And I think it always sat with him. And his family did business in Connecticut. So the story that Amy tells is one of basically a love triangle. There was Amy, there was Asenath Caroline Smith, the young girl involved, and then there was a doctor. So all 3 of these characters show up in Hawthorne's. The difference is that in Hawthorne's novel, she has the baby. In my true version of events, there was an abortion, and Amy was integral to it, and it comes out in the trial. And this is why this is a foundation case for Roe v. Wade. And so it is so you're going to ask the question, well, why did Hawthorne, was it just their sensibilities at the time? Did they not want to report this? No, abortion was a known thing in those days. It wasn't something which we invented in the 20th century or even in the late 19th century. It's been with us for a long time. So the listeners have to understand, and readers as well, that back in those days, the crime was not the abortion. The crime was the sex outside of marriage. And just let that sit with you for a while. So what happened in this case was the state's prosecutor went after this minister, Amy Rogers, for fornication outside of marriage, for basically seducing this young woman. She refused to testify. Initially, she had given, a deposition that yes. Then she fled this. He helped her flee the state. So basically, it turned out that because they couldn't bring her and compel her. Laws were different back then. There was no kidnapping, none of that. They couldn't compel her to return. So they were frustrated because they realized without her testimony, how would they find him guilty? 12:23. So what they decided to do after the fact, after the trial, they did find him guilty. I'm not giving anything away. Again, this is character driven and not necessarily giving the plot away. But so in the state of Connecticut, 2 or 3 years after this trial is when they began the process of criminalizing abortion in the state of Connecticut. But from my perspective, they went after this particular minister because he was in his early 40s. He was a widower, and he had a history of preying on young congregants. And so when Hawthorne discovered the story, and he had all 3 principals involved. He had the minister, the doctor, and the seamstress. And by the way, the real Asnith Caroline Smith was a seamstress, and so all the 3 main characters are there. And so later, much later, they decided that wouldn't it have been great if we could have gotten him on the abortion. And so that's where they started that process in Connecticut. But I think it was political persecution too, because Ammi was, and again, readers have to understand the time period. This was 20 years after the revolution, and he was an Episcopalian minister. And that was considered a Tory group, loyal to the king. And he was quite popular. He was, growing his following. He had a church where this event took place. He had one. He was a minister in Heber, and he was, all over the state of Connecticut. And I think that it was less about the woman involved and more about political persecution because, in the 1800s here in Connecticut, not to bore everybody with religion, but at that point in time, the state of Connecticut wanted to make Congregational Presbyterianism the state religion. So, as I guess the moral of the story is that things really never change. The politics are always the same. It's always religion and sex and people and political groups trying to manipulate people. And I think it's important to revisit these chapters in American history so that we learn something from them and identify with what's happening today versus what happened there and how we got here,
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few surprises here, just for me. I mean, one being, we think about Puritans, puritanical and
yes,
almost like sexless type people. Clearly not the case.
No, no,
Clearly not the case.
Yeah, and the emphasis was different then. The onus was on both the man and the woman, and mind you, Ammi was worried. In real terms, that he would be pilloried, that both of them might suffer real consequences, public consequences, and he went to great lengths. And not only did he try to move her out of state, but her sister as well, anybody who could testify against him. And so the book, the way I write the book is I start with Ammi Rogers. And I write it from his point of view, his early life, his early beginnings, what kind of a human being he was. And then I move from that to Caroline and write about it from her perspective. And then I even get into the various lawyers involved. I loved all of it. I loved all their perspectives. And, some people are surprised that I'm actually somewhat, that there seem to be, I don't want to call it sympathies towards him, but they're all human beings. And you have to respect each one of these are not characters. These were real people. There's one character in the book that's fictional, but mostly all of them, including the lawyers, were all real people. And I try to respect that and not, necessarily be damaging to them, and also try to see it from their point of view. But I view this, even though it's Amazon has it listed as romance. It's actually, to me, it's an American tragedy. But we don't have that category, do we? And there's no genre. And who wants to pick up a tragedy, right? But I think it is a classic American tragedy. And, you know, my novel is actually kind of an adaptation of the Scarlet Letter, but it is, you know, the true story. You know, at the end, people want to say, well, where is it? Where? Because so many scholars, with regard to the original, you know, with regard to the Scarlet Letter, uh, were so heavily invested, academics, in saying that he came up with that out of whole cloth. Well, he didn't. And it's not, it doesn't diminish it. It just means there was no, he didn't say, I got it from XYZ. But when I was doing, because I do extensive research, and I went to look for anything, any document anywhere that had Amy Rogers on it. And I did find a letter that was in a file of Hawthorne's relatives' documents with the Mass Historical Society. But if you didn't know the story, you wouldn't understand the significance of it now, would you? See, so that's the problem. So I'm hoping that scholars and others will dig deeper into the story, you know, and there are legal scholars who have now discovered it, because in 2018, you know, I had been interviewed by the Manchester JI, who were interested in the story of does the Scarlet Letter have its you know, roots in Connecticut. So I hope that, and there's a one legal scholar who's written a legal book, a law review article on this particular story, and her perspective is slightly different. You know, she sees it as a parable of sorts, taking the young girl and, you know, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, I feel like that's just one side of the story. It's true that after Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter, he created an entire genre. I don't know if people realize that, because it's no longer popular, but the genre involved a minister and a young woman. These were, I mean, there were copycats of The Scarlet Letter after that for decades, until probably the early 20th century, and it became less popular.
Yeah. You know, I just going back to just the time period and the crime being the fornication.
Yes.
You know, it's these are people who left England for, you know, because of religious persecution.
Mm-hmm.
And now their religious beliefs are persecuting people for doing very human things.
Mm-hmm. Nothing changes, does it?
No, it's like the new boss, same as the old boss.
Yeah, that's right. Same stuff, different day, right?
Townsend had it right when he wrote that lyric.
Yeah, no, it's really true. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. And if you don't study history, you're going to repeat the same mistakes. But yeah, I mean, and Amy Rogers believed that he was related to the martyr, you know, Rogers from England. And there's been no proof, by the way. After the fact, they've not been able to connect him. But he didn't have to become an Episcopalian minister. He made that decision when he was at Yale. And a lot of people will find this really fascinating, because a lot of this involves Yale, how they taught young men at that time, and where they thought they belonged in society. And so, yes, I think people have to take away from this that the crime was not the abortion, and people regularly practiced abortion in those days. A lot of times it was medicinal, but it was also mechanical. And in fact, prior to that, 2 years prior to this particular case, there was the case of a young woman in Pomfret. I'm sure you're familiar with all those Connecticut towns, and she died. So, you know, this was not without risk, not without peril, and she died. She was about 17 or 18, and it was a doctor who performed it, and he fled to Rhode Island, and they never were able to find him or persecute him or prosecute him or whatever they were going to do to him. But so this is not the first case. And but I think that in one sense, they felt the obligation rested on both people, not just on one over the other, or one person's decision versus another.
Yeah. I mean, we think of it as something that's more modern, abortion.
Well, that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this, because I could sense 10 years ago where we were going as a country, right? We were going back. We were going back. And I really felt that this was both entertainment and educational at the same time. And people have to understand it, because even some folks thought or think that it goes, back to the latter part of the 1800s, not as, it goes, I mean, it's been with us forever. But I thought that's why it was very important to tell this story, so that people understood that this is something which has always been with us. And as much as things change, they stay the same. The difference is that we've moved, at least thankfully, away from punishing people for fornicating outside of marriage. And that was the definition. It was marriage or nothing at all. And you could be prosecuted for those events if you had the witnesses.
Yeah. How did you go from like manuscript to like book on shelf? What was that journey like for you for this first one?
Well, I think for all of them, when you deal with when you're trying to basically write a what's the word, a nonfiction novel. That's what I would refer to it as opposed to creative nonfiction. I look at it like sculpting. Like, when you take a lump of clay and you're adding pieces to it. I mean, it's a movable thing. It's something I'm constantly working on and adding pieces to. Like, for instance, right now I'm working on a novel that's set in the same basic time period of 1790 to 1830, but it takes place during the French Revolution. So it's that same kind of thing. Like, where does history come in? Where do in other words, where do you zoom out and where do you come in? Where's your focus? So it's never, they always say when you write a novel, you should know what the ending is, right? Right? Know your ending and work backwards. Why? Because, it's hard. Stephen King is a good example of someone who does what if. He starts his novel with what if the world ended, and then he goes, but he doesn't have his ending. But with this, it's kind of I sort of know what my endings are generally. So I'm working backwards, and it's more like forming something in my eye. But I have to say that historical fiction takes a lot longer to produce. And I don't think it's as lucrative because it takes so much time. And I also found out after the fact, and I'm sure you can, you have 8 novels out there. And, I've looked at several of yours, and I know that, today you almost have to serialize everything, right? So the money's in the serializing. It's not in the, standalone books. I write standalone books. Those are not particularly lucrative because the reason you serialize is the first one's a lost leader, right? You give it away. It's free. It's 99 cents. It's whatever. It's so that they get hooked on you as an author, and then they want to buy more of your novels. But when you do a standalone, I think it's really difficult. And historical fiction is particularly onerous if it's done well, because you have to know. You can't have a zipper in the 1790s, or somebody striking a match, right? It's those little tiny things. And and as I was writing this particular book, I started challenging myself to do more with the writing. I don't think we do enough with writing today as authors. It's too minimalist. It's just get it out, let it flow from your fingertips. And then I started to say, well, I'm going to challenge myself to do a little bit more with bringing people through a scene. Do you know what I'm saying? Like through a room or through a building or through whatever, so that the scenes pop up as in language, but pop up. And, I think there's room to experiment and challenge yourself as a writer to do more than just minimalize what you're saying and what you're doing, because those are plot driven. And obviously, there's so much pressure on writers today. And I've listened to people over the years talk about there's no money in it. And that's true. I think it's a passion, right? I mean, it's got to be passion.
Like, if you're doing it to get rich, you're doing it for the wrong reasons, right? And of course, there are a few people out there who absolutely make a great living doing it. You mentioned Stephen King. I'm sure he doesn't have to work at Denny's. He doesn't.
But I sometimes wonder. We can get into this topic as one of interest to me, which is, will you ever see another Stephen King or another Patterson or whatever? Are you ever going to see that? Because we don't have here's my MBA. We do not have those mechanisms any longer. Even traditional publishing routes now require you as the author to market, right? And I mean, you tell me, you're a business person with experience in marketing. How do you get someone to click on buy a book? I mean, I have spent a lot of time thinking about that, about why does somebody put down real hard cash? Why should they? Why should you, what's your responsibility as an author? Why, forget King and Patterson and all they existed at a time when there was, the big publishing houses in one avenue. Everyone out there that's a writer has to understand that you and I, as authors, are competing against every book ever written today. We're no longer competing against the person that just, came out with a novel yesterday. It's everything because it's available to you online on pretty much, except for some very rare volumes. You can either buy it or you can go on Internet Archives and research it yourself. So it's a really different, brave new world out there. And you're absolutely right. People are not writing because they're making a ton of money at this. They're writing because they're passionate about it, or they're passionate about the story, or they enjoy it, or it's a hobby, or I don't know what. But I would love to see a conference that just focused on marketing, because there's a lot of blah, blah, blah about getting involved in social media. And I question a lot of that, right? Because you do
publishers, and I keep getting told this as my current manuscript keeps getting rejected by publishers. They want big social media numbers. Well, how does the average writer build a platform to get huge social media numbers before they've got the opportunity to publish their work?
Right. Well,
it's next to impossible unless you're buying them. And, in that case, you've got a bunch of Russian bots who are subscribing to you.
Yes, that's right. Right.
Blogs.
So here's my thought on it. And this comes from the whole starting a newspaper and direct mailing it. The direct approach is the best, whatever your Rolodex is, you literally send out individual. And I did this. Individual, not an email blast, but individual letters to people I know on my Rolodex that I've written a novel. And apparently the research backs this up, that you're more likely to sell a novel to people who know you. And that's why when you become famous, it's a little bit easier and they trust. But I think the numbers are abysmal. When you do the stats on how many, you can take 50,000 followers might result in 5 sales, right? Challenge me if I'm wrong, because I'll accept anything you have to say. But, from the numbers I've been looking at, and then you get into do you pay for clicks? Do you pay for impressions? And clicks are the things that are going to result in your ratings going up and possibly a sale. But I think that's, going back to your original question, how did you get sidetracked from writing? Because of this, because everybody has to, at least at some point in their lives, I'm fortunately beyond that, but at some point in your life, you've got to put bread on the table, a roof over your head, educate your kids, do all those things that we do. So, but I never gave up on my bucket list of things I wanted to do. And I don't think anybody should ever do that. They should always have that as this is where I want to go. But,
and it's never too late to do it either. I've talked to so many people who have, their first, I talked to a woman a few weeks ago, her first novel was published at 72.
Right.
So it's never too late to do it, and to sort of, in other words, wherever you are in life should never be a barrier. If you're passionate about doing it, you should not let that.
Well, I think people have different objectives, though. I think if you're 72, if you're the Grandma Moses of journalism or of writing, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you're at a different point in your life. But it's those people, the young people that are in their 30s who aspire to be writers, have to be wide-eyed about this. That I think those days of runaway bestseller authors is kind of maybe perhaps behind us. I don't know, but I know there's a lot of work. I mean, you've been down this road many, many times, and it's the launch. It's it's all the PR, it's the marketing, it's the ongoing advertising. It's, you can drive yourself crazy. When do you get back to writing? That's a question people always ask me, right? When do you find time to write if you're doing all of that?
Well, the writing, what people learn, some people think that the writing is the hard part. Well, the writing turns out is actually the easy part. The hard part is
That's right.
the business of it all, right?
That's right.
So it's doing the marketing, the PR. You really are, you have to think of yourself as a small business owner if you are an author, and particularly if you're an indie author, because it's all on your shoulders. You have created a product, you now have to market that product.
Right.
You got to get your 4 Ps, your 6 Ps, depending on when you went to business school.
Yeah. I mean, it's really true. It's I call it chief cook and bottle washer. I mean, you're out there doing all of it, and none of it really well. I mean, thankfully the novel was done well because you had blinders on, and you were. I mean, you've written 8 novels. I've written 5. This is the first one I've let out into the world. I have another one that's ready to go, and I'm kind of holding back on it because I'm, just wondering to see how this goes, what this great experiment, I call it, to see how it actually unveils. I mean, I don't aspire to making a fortune. You'd like to break even. I'm not even sure you do that. And I don't know if people know that. I mean, it's really, and even with traditional publishing, I mean, there's not a lot of budget out there for marketing and advertising, and there are not the freestanding bookstores like there used to be, where you could walk in and there'd be a display of your books there and so forth. So it's not for the faint of heart. You put yourself out there, right? You're open to every kind of criticism, right? It's your writing. It's what you're writing about. It's how you handled it. Everything. And so you're really exposing yourself. And then and the insult to all of that, or the injury, so you're not getting paid a lot for it.
Well, it does require a tremendous amount of vulnerability, because
it really does.
You're going to get rejected by a lot of people.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yes.
Finding an agent, lots of rejections, even when you have the agent,
lots of rejections.
Publishers, lots of rejections. Reviews. Not everyone's going to love what you did. So you're going to have to face that too.
Yeah. So here we are bringing up all of these touchy feelings.
Yeah, you have to have thick skin. Yes. If you love it, you can't help but do it. That's the other thing. I don't know.
Oh, yes.
I've tried to stop. I tell my wife I can quit anytime I want.
Yeah, there you go.
But they keep pulling me back in.
I know, it's true. And
says in Godfather 3.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, but because for me that moment when I get pulled in is first thing in the morning, early in the morning, and you dive into a character or a subject or a topic or whatever. And you're right, it's really hard, and the joy, the pleasure is in the writing.
Yeah.
Everything else is work. I mean, everything else is work. And as you said, there, I look at it as a badge of courage. I mean, I've kept all my rejections. I'm sure you have too. I mean, why not?
Yeah. By the way, they all want something new and creative and something that's different. And all the rejection letters are the same. There's nothing creative about a rejection letter. They should take their own advice and be creative with the form rejection letters.
Well, the best ones I like is we want commercial fiction. Well, that translates to we want to make money. and I always got a lot of, the writing is excellent. The writing is great. The story is great, but it doesn't fit with what we want. But here's the thing, at least from all the research I've done, nobody in the publishing world can tell you what makes a success. What's a successful novel. If they did, they would be, you know what I'm saying? And back in the day when there were the big 5 and all the publishing houses, it was the 80-20 rule. 20% of their novelists, their hits, they were able to bring along 80% of the writing world. Under a different world, you and I would probably have found ourselves swept up in the stream of the top 20% bringing along, but that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
And I think I hate to say this, but even the greats, the people we're talking about, the successful authors, I think they're struggling. They're out there doing the same thing. They're on Instagram. They're on Threads. They're on, they've got Facebook page. They're doing the same thing. And so
and then they come here and talk to me.
Oh, is that true? There you go.
I mean,
Well, I'll tell you what. If I had to do it over again, if it was only money, and hindsight's always 2020, I would do adult coloring books because that turns out to be the most successful in terms of monetary value, right? Have you seen that?
Sure. Put some of that in your portfolio. Maybe that could be the revenue that fuels the stuff that you really want to write. You never know.
Right. I thought it was funny though. It's adult coloring books. Who knew, right?
I know. One of my kids gave me one for my birthday one year, and I was kind of mortified by it, but it was just because who gave it to me.
Yeah, but people enjoy them. They're relaxation, and I don't know how to do them. I don't know how to produce them, but I know they're money makers, and there's just. But I don't have any regrets. I think this is a good way to spend your time, your free time. Keeps you out of traffic, and you're not getting into all sorts of other trouble. So I have no regrets about it.
Fair enough, Pat. I always like to end with a few questions that I ask many of my guests about pop culture, and you know what you're in for. So I'm curious, when you were growing up, favorite movies or things to watch on TV? Did you have anything?
Yeah, I would say that's probably a no-brainer, The Twilight Zone. Talk about, right? Has that not held up?
Do you have a favorite episode?
Oh, yes. I can't think of the name of it, but you'll know this if you're a fan. It's the one with the boy who controls all the adults in the room with his mind and turns them into jack-in-the-boxes if he doesn't get what he wants. And anyone who's had children knows exactly what that's like. Do you remember that episode?
I don't remember that one, but mine is with William Shatner, the man in the
Oh, yes, the man in the
iconic. Or the one where the doctors are operating on this woman. They're doing something on her face.
Yes.
And they can't, and then they reveal that she's a beautiful woman, but all the doctors have like pig noses or something like that.
Yeah. Well, all of those. I mean, he certainly was a genius. I mean, he really was. I mean, there's just so many of those, or where there were two. After you reached a certain age, you had to pick a particular face. So there were only like two choices, and all the themes are there, and. The reason that some of these are still so current in my mind is that every holiday season, around Christmas, they'll do AMC will do a 24, 48-hour period of nothing but those oldies but goodies. And the one with Shatner is absolutely a classic. Or the one where everybody steps out of their house and it's foggy and it turns out they've been lifted to another planet.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes on and on. But yeah, I guess that's my best pop culture one.
How about music? What did you like listening to growing up?
Well, I know these are your questions that you like to ask, and I discussed it with my husband, and he said I should say, well, I love listening to my husband play guitar, and here he is. Aren't you like that? I guess, it's an eclectic range. And what I have to say is that do you listen to music when you write? Because I do.
I do not.
Oh, you don't? Oh, well, I'll have to have the headphones in, and depending, like the second novel that I've written, Journey to the Isle of Devils, takes place in Jamaica, and it's about Matthew Gregory Lewis. He was called the monk in his day. He wrote an erotic novel in the 1700s, and he's very famous. And for his time period, he's considered the uncle of the Gothic novel. And so when I was writing that book, I was listening to a lot of reggae. Now, with this particular French Revolution, I'm Les Miserables. I mean, I'm listening. This is what I do. I just whatever I'm writing, I put on headphones and I listen to music and I just get into the mood that way. So
it's like method. It's like method writing.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, and it's funny because I don't know if you know David Gaffin. He's an Irish writer. Yeah. Every Friday he sends out a blast, and he'll recommend music to listen to, and I can always tell what he's writing. I don't know if you know that part of he writes some other novels besides historical fiction, but I can always tell based off of his suggestions for music.
Yeah. So he's got to tell. He's got to tell. But
Yeah.
anything, I mean, did you like anything, in your, I'm thinking about your teenage years, like what you may have had, walking around listening to or kind of playing?
Well, you know, I guess, this is going to sound really strange, but again, it's another classic is the Beach Boys. And I've since listened to um, or watched the documentaries on. I mean, there's another genius writer and group with a lot of staying power. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's how I would answer it, other than having my husband come in and play guitar for you.
Brian Wilson seems like a pretty interesting guy. Like,
Oh, another American
yeah,
tragedy. I mean, a real genius. It seemed like everything he wrote just had staying power.
yeah.
So yeah,
I mean,
but
you think of them as like this California sound, happy time
mhm,
surfing, but there's a lot of darkness there. There's a
yes,
lot of darkness there.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that comes through in his writing and in his music, and yeah. So, but those are always tough questions because
Yeah.
you just kind of live along your life, and um, and I think there's a long period when I had children where you're not really watching TV and you're not really listening to music, right? I mean, you're raising children. You're going to Transformer movies and things like that.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true. That's very,
Yeah.
very true. How about if you could go back in time and whisper some words of advice into your younger self? And I'll pick the age. The younger Pat who was taking that journalism class in high school. Um, what would you tell her? What advice?
Well, that's an easy one. I would say keep a journal. And and many times in my life I tried just so I can tell I did try. The problem is you can't value your own life and your own information quite the same way that someone else might be able to. In other words, and when I say keep a journal, I don't mean the highlights or the lowlights. I mean just the mundane and the boring, right? Because those are the chestnuts. Those are the
Yeah.
things that are really valuable. Just the ordinary. Who was at that family dinner? What did you guys eat? What did you talk about? Because the mind's eye tends to just focus on highlights and lowlights, and we miss all that in between. So I think if I had to do it over again, I'd make that effort. I have kept journals at different points in my life. When I worked at the Mental Health Association, I kept some journals because there were some fascinating things that went on, but they're not as elaborate as I'd like. They're not as detailed as I want now. So I think, yeah, it's never too late to do that because everybody wants. Certainly, historians want those little chestnuts, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of wealth of information out there today, but how much of it? How do you go through the wheat and chaff on that, right? I don't
Yeah.
know.
I think, kids in today's generation, do keep journals. They just call it Instagram. 'Cause
Yeah, but
it's
who
not the
owns?
same.
It's
Not the
not the
same.
same, and it's also visual.
Yeah.
So it's not interpretive; it's visual. It's um, it's a broad brush, and also who owns that? I mean, every time a photograph is taken, you don't own that at that point. That's out there in the ethernet. I say this to people all the time: put up your family photos on Facebook, and Zuckerberg owns them. Because we're all. I mean, what a lucky world we live in that we have the opportunity to upload a novel, or for you and I to have this chat right remotely
Yeah.
to have this discussion. Isn't that it's marvelous? It's wonderful. But you have to keep in mind that you're there by the grace of YouTube or the podcast or Instagram, whatever the platform is. You're entering their house, and they set the rules,
Mhm.
and we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. But keeping a journal is kind of a simplistic thing, but you own it, and I guess that's what I would say because there's so much that I don't have documented. I no longer have documented.
Yeah. Well, Pat, this has been a fun conversation. I'm curious, where can people learn more about you? Are you active on social media since we just started talking about it?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have a
Well,
website? What can you share?
yes, you can go to patsuprenant.com That's a mouthful, but you can also find me on Instagram, also on Facebook. I'm on Threads. The usual thing. What am I not on? I have an account on X, but I'm not really very active on that. Mostly I do it just so that I can read, but I'm, the usual array of social media. But to say how active, yeah, I do post. I mean, you can't do this work that you and I are in, right, without participating to some extent in it. And LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn, and so there are a variety of ways that people can reach me. There's a contact form. I'm open to basically anybody. In fact, out of the blue, one of the ancestors by the way, I didn't say this in the beginning, but both families of both the young woman and the man, the minister, have contact. I've had conversations with both families, descendants of, yeah. And the descendant of the young woman, the family still lives in the area, and they still have their farm, is still the longest held farm in Connecticut by one family. So he found me. So I'm receptive and open to anything other than spam, but you get a lot of that too. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, very cool, Pat. I'll put all of your contact information in our show notes so people can easily go to that website or your social media accounts. And I want to say thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Well, thank you for having me. It was lots of fun, and I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlon uncork a new story.